They called her the Whale of Wall Street behind her back. When Albert Sterling, the most feared syndicate boss on the eastern seaboard, married Beatrice Gallagher, the underworld laughed. She was a heavily built, plain-faced daughter of a broke accountant, a supposed pawn in a marriage of convenience. High society mocked her unpolished manners, her size, and her silence. They thought she was a helpless joke, a lamb sent to the slaughterhouse of mob politics. But they didn't know the dark truth about her bloodline. And on the night a rival faction breached Albert's heavily fortified estate, the laughter stopped permanently. Because the helpless joke locked the doors from the inside and butchered them all. The wedding of Albert Sterling was not a celebration. It was a strategic acquisition, executed with the cold, sterile precision of a corporate merger. Albert was 34, a man whose tailored Savile Row suits hid the scars of a violent ascension to the top of the Sterling syndicate. He controlled the docks from Boston to Baltimore, and his name was whispered with genuine terror in the boardrooms of both legitimate shipping companies and illicit smuggling rings. He was ruthless, calculating, and devastatingly handsome in a sharp, predatory way. And his bride? Beatrice Gallagher was the punchline of a joke nobody dared to laugh at in Albert's presence. Beatrice was 26, introverted, and unmistakably heavy. In a world where Mafia wives were expected to be imported supermodels or sleek, Pilates-toned socialites draped in diamonds, Beatrice stood out like a brutalist concrete building in a neighborhood of glass mansions. She had soft, round features, a quiet demeanor, and a body that took up space. Space the elite women of Albert's circle felt she had no right to occupy. The marriage was a matter of grim mathematics. Beatrice's father, Thomas Gallagher, was an underground forensic accountant who had embezzled a fatal sum from a rival Russian faction, the Volkov Bratva, to pay off massive gambling debts. To save his own skin, Thomas came to Albert with a ledger containing every dirty secret the Volkovs possessed. Albert took the ledger, but he required insurance. He demanded Thomas's daughter as a wife. A legally binding spouse couldn't be forced to testify against him, and marrying an unassuming, docile woman presented a facade of domestic stability to the old-school Italian families who still held sway over the East Coast Commission. On the day of the wedding at a sprawling, hyper-secure estate in the Hamptons, the whispers were deafening. "Look at her," murmured Cynthia DuPont, the sleek wife of one of Albert's lieutenants, her voice dripping with venom, as Beatrice walked down the aisle in a custom Vera Wang gown that struggled to accommodate her broad frame. "She looks like a marshmallow wrapped in lace. Albert must be paying off a karmic debt." Beside her, Reginald Astor, a corrupt state senator on Albert's payroll, chuckled into his champagne glass. "I hear he had to widen the doors of the penthouse. It's a tragedy, really. A man of Albert's stature tethered to a woman who couldn't outrun a light breeze." Beatrice heard them. She always heard them. As she stood at the altar, her eyes met Albert's. His gaze was icy, unreadable. He took her hand, his long, calloused fingers wrapping around her thick, soft ones. There was no warmth in his touch, only the possessive grip of a warden. Beatrice kept her head bowed, playing the role of the terrified, out-of-her-depth civilian perfectly. She let her shoulders slump, made her breathing erratic, and allowed a slight tremor in her hands when he slipped the massive 5-carat diamond onto her finger. But behind the veil, Beatrice's mind was a hyperactive tactical map. She wasn't trembling from fear. She was scanning the perimeter. She noted the placement of Albert's bodyguards, identifying the subtle bulges of concealed carry beneath their tuxedos. She calculated the distance from the altar to the nearest reinforced exit. 32 yards. Thomas Gallagher wasn't just a cowardly accountant. He was a deeply paranoid survivalist who knew his profession would one day bring the wolves to his door. While other girls were learning ballet and etiquette, Beatrice was in a soundproofed basement in rural Pennsylvania, stripping down assault rifles blindfolded. Her father had fed her a steady diet of hand-to-hand combat training, psychological endurance, and tactical defense. Her weight was a product of a thyroid condition, yes, but beneath the soft exterior was a dense, heavily muscled core built from years of dragging 150-pound sandbags through the mud. She let the world think she was a victim. It was the ultimate camouflage. And as Albert leaned in to kiss her, a brief, perfunctory press of his lips against hers, Beatrice silently vowed that she would survive this gilded cage, no matter who she had to break to do it. Life as Mrs. Albert Sterling was an exercise in psychological endurance. Albert moved Beatrice into his penthouse overlooking Central Park, a cold, minimalist fortress of glass and steel. He was rarely home, spending his nights managing his empire, leaving Beatrice isolated with the very people who despised her. The syndicate's inner circle treated her with a mixture of overt condescension and cruel amusement. The ringleader of her tormentors was Vincent Hayes, Albert's ambitious and deeply arrogant underboss. Vincent was a man who believed he should be sitting in Albert's chair, and he viewed Albert's weak choice of a bride as proof that the boss was losing his edge. 3 months into the marriage, Albert forced Beatrice to attend a high-profile charity gala at the Plaza Hotel. It was a mandatory show of unity. Beatrice wore a deep emerald gown that, despite its masterful tailoring, drew sneers from the skeletal women dripping in Cartier. Albert left her side almost immediately to discuss union contracts with a corrupt official, leaving Beatrice abandoned near the ice sculptures. Vincent Hayes approached, a smug smile plastered across his sharp face, with his mistress, Camilla, clinging to his arm. Camilla was everything Beatrice was not: tall, razor-thin, and conventionally breathtaking. "Mrs. Sterling," Vincent purred, stepping too close, invading her personal space. "Enjoying the buffet? I told the catering staff to make sure they kept the carving station well stocked for you." Camilla giggled, a sharp, grating sound. "Careful, Vincent. Don't upset the bride. We wouldn't want her to trip and cause a seismic event." Beatrice kept her eyes downcast, clutching a glass of sparkling water. "Excuse me," she murmured softly, her voice intentionally meek. She took a step back, feigning clumsiness, and allowed her heel to catch the edge of the carpet. She stumbled, spilling a few drops of water onto Vincent's polished Italian leather shoes. "Watch it, you clumsy cow," Vincent snapped, dropping the polite facade. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. From across the room, Albert saw the commotion and began walking over, his expression darkening. But before he could intervene, Beatrice did something no one noticed. She didn't pull away. Instead, she subtly shifted her body weight, dropping her center of gravity and pressing a specific nerve cluster on the inside of Vincent's wrist with a seemingly panicked grasp of her own. Vincent gasped, his hand going instantly numb as a shockwave of pain shot up to his elbow. He released her instantly, stumbling backward, his face pale. I'm so sorry," Beatrice stammered, her voice trembling as Albert finally reached them. "Is there a problem here, Vincent?" Albert's voice was dangerously quiet. Vincent, rubbing his numb arm and looking thoroughly confused as to why his limb had suddenly died, shook his head. "No, boss. Just an accident. Your wife lost her footing." Albert looked at Beatrice, his eyes narrowing slightly. He noticed she wasn't crying. He noticed her pulse, visible at the base of her neck, was a steady, calm 60 beats per minute. A woman who had just been publicly humiliated and physically grabbed should have been erratic, panicked. Beatrice was perfectly calm. "Let's go," Albert said, placing a hand on the small of her back. It was the first time since the wedding he had voluntarily touched her outside of a photo op. The ride back to the penthouse was silent, but Albert was watching her in the reflection of the limousine window. He was a predator, and predators recognize when prey isn't acting like prey. Later that night, after Albert had retired to his study, Beatrice retreated to her massive, separate bedroom. She locked the door, bypassed the digital security feed with a scrambled frequency jammer her father had built for her, and walked to the sprawling walk-in closet. She moved a heavy, velvet ottoman aside, pried up a false floorboard she had meticulously carved out over the past 3 months, and withdrew a matte black Glock 19, heavily modified with a threaded barrel and a customized trigger pull. She sat on the floor, ignoring the plush silk of her nightgown, and practiced dry firing. Her movements were a blur of violent efficiency. Draw, aim, fire, reload, over and over in the dark. The Volkovs were coming. She knew it. The ledger her father gave Albert was damaging, but it wasn't the killing blow. The Russians wouldn't let Albert consolidate power. They would strike. And Beatrice knew that when the wolves broke through the door, the elite snobs who mocked her size wouldn't last 5 seconds. She would have to be the monster in the dark. The storm hit New York in mid-November, bringing sheets of freezing rain that battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of Albert's upstate compound, a fortress nestled in the Catskills where they had retreated for the weekend. The estate was guarded by 12 heavily armed men from Galloway's private security, an elite firm contracted by the syndicate. It should have been impenetrable, but betrayal always leaves the door unlocked. Vincent Hayes, humiliated and greedy for the throne, had sold the security schematics to the Volkov brothers. At 2 a.m., the power to the estate was cut. The backup generators never engaged. Beatrice was awake. She had been awake since 1 a.m., when she noticed the ambient hum of the estate's localized cellular tower drop out. A jammer. She slipped out of bed, instantly trading her silk nightgown for a pair of dark tactical cargo pants and a fitted black sweater she kept hidden. She strapped a tactical holster to her heavy thigh, sliding the Glock into place, and slipped a KA bar combat knife into her boot. Down the hall, Albert was in his study, going over shipping manifests by the light of a gas fireplace. When the lights died, Albert didn't panic. He reached for the revolver under his desk. But he was too late. The mahogany doors of the study blew inward with a suppressed thump of a breaching charge. 4 men in night vision goggles and tactical black spilled into the room. Albert fired twice, dropping the first man, but a suppressed round clipped his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the floor behind his heavy oak desk. Blood soaked through his white dress shirt. He was pinned down, outgunned, and bleeding. He gritted his teeth, waiting for the inevitable execution. He thought of his empire, his legacy, and, briefly, his useless, heavy wife sleeping down the hall, who would undoubtedly be slaughtered like livestock. Out in the hallway, Beatrice heard the breach. She moved with a terrifying silence, her bare feet making 0 sound on the cold marble floors. She didn't run away. She advanced toward the gunfire. 2 men were standing guard outside the study, watching the perimeter, their rifles raised. They were professionals, scanning the dark corridor through their green-tinted night vision optics. Beatrice knew that against night vision, movement was death. She waited in the alcove of a large marble statue, letting the shadows mask her bulk. As one of the guards stepped closer to her position, turning his head to communicate via radio, Beatrice struck. She didn't use finesse. She used her 220 pounds of dense, heavily trained mass. She launched herself forward, driving her shoulder directly into the man's sternum with the force of a freight train. The impact shattered his ribs instantly, the sickening crunch echoing in the quiet hall. Before he could even exhale, Beatrice reached up, grabbed the back of his tactical helmet, and violently twisted his neck. The sharp snap was definitive. The second guard spun around, raising his rifle, shocked by the sudden, silent takedown of his partner. He saw a massive, dark silhouette. He hesitated for half a second, a fatal mistake. Beatrice closed the gap, swiping the Ka bar knife from her boot in one fluid motion. She parried the barrel of his rifle aside with her left forearm, ignoring the bruising pain, and drove the heavy combat knife upward, directly beneath his Kevlar vest, burying it into his diaphragm. She twisted the blade and pulled it out, letting his body drop to the floor without a sound. She picked up the dead man's suppressed submachine gun, checked the action, and stepped into the doorway of the study. Inside, the two remaining assassins were advancing on Albert's desk. Albert, clutching his bleeding shoulder, braced himself for death. "Hey!" A soft, feminine voice echoed in the dark room. The two Russians spun around. Beatrice stood in the doorway, framed by the faint moonlight filtering through the rain-streaked windows. She looked nothing like the clumsy, terrified woman Albert had married. Her stance was wide, professional, her eyes cold and dead. Before the assassins could raise their weapons, Beatrice raised the submachine gun. She didn't spray wildly. She fired in rapid, controlled bursts. Pop, pop. One man took 2 rounds to the face, his night vision goggles shattering into bloody plastic. Pop, pop. The second man caught 2 rounds in the throat, gurgling as he collapsed onto Albert's Persian rug. Silence descended on the room, broken only by the sound of the rain and the dying gurgles of the Russian hitman. Albert slowly pulled himself up from behind the desk, clutching his shoulder. He stared at the bodies scattered across his floor, then looked at the doorway. Beatrice walked in, her face splattered with a few drops of blood. She didn't look at Albert immediately. She methodically walked to each body, checking their pulses, completely unbothered by the carnage. Finally, she slung the weapon over her shoulder and looked at her husband, her expression utterly blank. "You're bleeding," she stated softly, her voice returning to its usual, quiet tone. Albert, the most feared man on the eastern seaboard, looked at his heavily built, mocked and humiliated wife. His mind struggled to process the sheer, brutal efficiency he had just witnessed. Who the hell are you?" Albert breathed out, the pain in his shoulder momentarily forgotten in the face of absolute shock. Beatrice knelt beside him, ripping a piece of fabric from one of the dead men's shirts to apply pressure to Albert's wound. She looked him dead in the eye, the shy, clumsy girl completely gone. "I'm your insurance policy," she whispered. "Now get up." They cut the hard lines, and we have 8 more men sweeping the ground floor. If you want to live to kill Vincent Hayes for setting us up, you need to follow my lead. The air in the hallway was thick with the acrid stench of cordite and the undeniable metallic tang of arterial blood. Albert Sterling, a man who had orchestrated the executions of dozens of men, found himself relegated to the role of a bystander in his own home. He pressed the torn, bloody fabric against his shoulder, his teeth gritted against the searing pain as he watched his wife work. Beatrice moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that entirely defied her heavy frame. Her thick thighs and broad shoulders, the very features the women of high society had sneered at, provided a low, unshakable center of gravity. She didn't walk, she glided, her bare feet silent against the imported Italian marble. "Stay behind me and step exactly where I step," Beatrice whispered, her voice devoid of the timid stutter she had weaponized for months. "They have tactical comms. The men downstairs will realize the second floor is dark in exactly 40 seconds. Albert followed, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the slick blood of the man Beatrice had gutted. As they reached the grand staircase, the sweeping, wrought-iron centerpiece of the estate, Beatrice held up a clenched fist. "Hold!" Below them, The beams of 3 tactical flashlights cut through the darkness of the grand foyer. "Status on 2," a gruff voice echoed over a localized radio frequency. "Dmitri, report." Silence. "Breach the stairs," the voice commanded, a sudden edge of panic bleeding into the Russian accent. Beatrice didn't wait for them to ascend. She leaned over the heavy oak banister, her customized Glock 19 materializing in her right hand. She didn't aim with one eye closed like an amateur. She kept both eyes open, maintaining her peripheral vision. Thwip, thwip, the suppressed subsonic rounds spat from the barrel. The first Russian at the base of the stairs dropped instantly, a neat hole punched through the top of his Kevlar helmet. Before the remaining 2 could pivot their rifles upward, Beatrice had already shifted her angle. Thwip, thwip, thwip. 2 more bodies hit the imported Persian rug below. The precision was surgical. It wasn't the wild spraying of a terrified civilian. It was the calculated rhythm of a Tier 1 operator. "Clear," Beatrice murmured, descending the stairs rapidly. She didn't spare the bodies a second glance as she stepped over them, making a beeline for the service hallway that led to the garage. "The Maybach is armored," Albert grunted, catching up to her, his breath coming in shallow, pained gasps. "Keys are in the security office." "No!" Beatrice snapped, her tone authoritative, brooking no argument from the boss of the Sterling Syndicate. "If Vincent sold the security schematics, he sold the vehicle trackers. We take the landscaper's truck." 5 minutes later, they were tearing down the muddy service road in a battered 10-year-old Chevrolet Tahoe, the headlights off, navigating strictly by the faint moonlight reflecting off the freezing rain. Albert sat in the passenger seat, his face pale, blood soaking through his ruined dress shirt and pooling on the vinyl seat. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the crushing, throbbing reality of a bullet wound. "There's a medical kit under the rear floorboard," Beatrice said, her eyes locked on the treacherous road. "In the black Pelican case. Grab it." Albert managed to haul the heavy case onto his lap, popping the latches. Inside wasn't a standard first aid kit. It was a military-grade trauma pack complete with quick-clot combat gauze, a tourniquet, surgical staples, and intravenous saline. "Who trained you?" Albert demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a burning, obsessive curiosity. The woman gripping the steering wheel was a stranger, a beautiful, terrifying stranger. Beatrice kept her eyes on the road. "My father was a coward, but he wasn't stupid. When he started cooking the books for the Volkov Bratva, he knew his life expectancy dropped to 0. He also knew that if he was killed, the Bratva would take me to settle his debts." She whipped the Tahoe around a sharp bend, the heavy vehicle sliding in the mud before her expert countersteering caught the traction. "While the girls I grew up with were going to finishing school and getting nose jobs, my father was paying exorbitant, off-the-books fees to private military contractors, guys out of Moyock, North Carolina, ex-Rangers, disgraced CIA operatives, men who worked for Academy and Triple Canopy." Beatrice's voice was utterly flat, stating facts rather than seeking pity. "They spent 10 years turning a heavy, awkward girl with a thyroid condition into a ghost. They taught me how to strip a weapon in the dark, how to sever an artery with a pen, and how to make people look right through me." Albert stared at her profile. The soft curve of her jaw, the plushness of her lips. It was the ultimate disguise. High society worshipped frail, sharp angles. They equated softness with weakness. Beatrice had used their own shallow prejudices against them. "You played me," Albert said softly, an unrecognizable emotion stirring in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was awe. "I survived you, Albert," Beatrice corrected, glancing at him. "You bought me as a pawn. You expected me to sit quietly in your penthouse while your underboss and his skeletal mistress mocked me. I played the role to stay alive, to stay invisible. because I knew the Volkoffs would come. She pulled the Tahoe into the rusted, corrugated iron bay of an abandoned shipyard in Red Hook, Brooklyn, a safe house even Albert's lieutenants didn't know about, secured by Beatrice weeks ago. She killed the engine and turned to him. "Take your shirt off," she ordered. "I need to pack that wound before you bleed out on my upholstery." Albert didn't argue. He stripped off his ruined jacket and shirt, shivering in the freezing air. Beatrice climbed into the back, bringing the trauma kit. She worked with brutal efficiency, her thick, warm fingers probing the wound. The bullet had passed clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder, missing the bone and the subclavian artery by a fraction of an inch. She packed the entry and exit wounds with quick clot gauze, ignoring Albert's sharp hiss of pain. As she leaned in close to apply the pressure dressing, Albert inhaled the scent of her: sweat, rain, and gunpowder. He reached up with his good arm, his blood-stained hand wrapping around the back of her neck, pulling her face mere inches from his. Beatrice froze, her dark eyes locking onto his piercing blue ones. "Vincent Hayes set us up," Albert whispered, his breath ghosting over her lips. "He thinks I'm dead. He thinks you're dead. By tomorrow night, he's going to call a meeting of the commission to declare himself the new head of the Sterling Syndicate." "I know," Beatrice replied, not pulling away, her pulse remaining infuriatingly steady under his grip. "He humiliated you. For months," Albert continued, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her jawline, leaving a streak of his own blood on her pale skin. "He let his whore mock you in my presence. He thought you were a joke." "And what did you think, Albert?" Beatrice challenged, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. A slow, dark smile spread across the Mafia boss's face. The polite, sterile boundaries of their arranged marriage had burned down in the upstate estate, leaving only the raw, violent truth of their existence. "I think," Albert murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips before meeting her gaze again, "that my wife is the most dangerous creature in New York. And I think it's time we teach high society how to respect the Queen." The private dining room at the Core Club in Midtown Manhattan was the epitome of exclusionary opulence. Rich mahogany walls, low amber lighting, and the subtle clinking of baccarat crystal glasses scored the room. Vincent Hayes sat at the head of the long, polished table. He was dressed in a bespoke, charcoal Tom Ford suit, a glass of Macallan 25 resting near his hand. Flanking him were the 4 remaining capos of the Sterling Syndicate, men who controlled the unions, the docks, the politicians, and the underground casinos. Sitting to Vincent's right was Camilla, poured into a skin-tight, backless crimson dress dripping in diamonds that, until yesterday, had been locked in the Syndicate's vault. "It's a tragedy, gentlemen. A profound, senseless tragedy," Vincent was saying, his voice dripping with faux sorrow as he addressed the capos. Albert was a visionary, but he grew soft. Marrying that pathetic, bloated cow from the Gallagher family was a sign of his declining mental state. It made us look weak to the Russians. Salvatore, a grizzled capo from the Bronx, frowned. "The Volkoffs hit the upstate compound. Our inside men said the place was a fortress with a rotting foundation," Vincent lied smoothly. Albert couldn't protect his own home. He and the girl were butchered in their sleep. I have already initiated retaliatory strikes against the Bratva. But the Syndicate needs leadership. It needs a firm hand to guide us through this war. Vincent raised his glass. To Albert. Before the capos could raise their glasses, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room opened. Vincent's 2 massive armed bodyguards, stationed inside the room by the door, immediately reached into their jackets. But they stopped dead, their hands hovering over their holstered weapons. Standing in the doorway was Beatrice Sterling. She wasn't wearing tactical gear. She was dressed in a stunning, custom-tailored black velvet morning gown that hugged her curves and accentuated her broad, imposing silhouette. Her hair was swept up in a tight, elegant twist, and her face was a mask of cold, imperious calm. The room plunged into an absolute, suffocating silence. Camilla dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the floorboards with a sharp crack. Mrs. Sterling," Vincent stammered, all the colour draining from his sharp face. His mind raced. How? The Volkoffs said they levelled the second floor. How did this heavy, useless woman escape? "Vincent," Beatrice said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. She stepped inside, and with a casual, almost bored flick of her wrist, she pushed the heavy oak door shut behind her. The heavy brass lock clicked into place with a sound like a guillotine dropping. "Where are my men outside?" Vincent demanded, recovering his composure, his hand creeping toward the Smith & Wesson snub-nose revolver tucked into his waistband. "How did you get past security?" "Your security is currently sleeping in the service elevator," Beatrice replied softly. They were remarkably easy to subdue. They expect danger to look like men with assault rifles. They don't expect it to look like a grieving widow. Camilla let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Look at her, Vincent. She's in shock. The poor whale is delirious. God, get her out of here before she embarrasses herself." One of the bodyguards, a towering brute named Rocco, stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "Come on, lady, let's take a walk." He reached out a massive hand to grab her shoulder. It happened so fast the capos at the table barely registered the movement. Beatrice didn't step back. She stepped into Rocco's guard. She caught his outstretched wrist with her left hand, twisting it outward with brutal, bone-snapping torque, while simultaneously driving the heel of her right hand upward in a devastating palm strike squarely into his throat. Rocco's windpipe crushed with a sickening crunch. His eyes rolled back into his head, and his massive body hit the floor like a felled oak tree, gasping and choking on his own ruined cartilage. The second bodyguard drew his weapon, but Beatrice was already moving. She dropped her center of gravity, sweeping her leg in a brutal arc that shattered the man's kneecap. As he screamed and buckled forward, Beatrice grabbed the back of his head and drove his face down into the sharp edge of a brass serving cart. He slumped to the floor, unconscious and bleeding heavily. She stood up, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her velvet gown, entirely unbothered by the carnage at her feet. She looked at the stunned capos, then at a trembling, hyperventilating Camilla, and finally at Vincent. "I am not in shock, Camilla," Beatrice said quietly. "I am just finishing the cleanup." From the shadows of the hallway outside, a figure emerged, using a master keycard to open the locked doors Beatrice had just sealed. Albert Sterling stepped into the room. His left arm was in a black silk sling, and he looked pale, but the predatory fire in his blue eyes burned hotter than ever. He walked past Beatrice, stopping to press a brief, possessive kiss to her temple, a gesture that sent shockwaves through the capos who had thought he despised her. "Albert," Vincent whispered, dropping back into his chair, his hands shaking violently. "Hello, Vincent," Albert said smoothly, walking toward the head of the table. The capos scrambled to their feet, bowing their heads in immediate, terrified deference to their resurrected boss. "Boss, I swear, I thought the Russians, they told me," Vincent babbled, the suave, arrogant underboss dissolving into a pathetic puddle of terror. Albert stopped at the edge of the table. He didn't yell. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply looked at Beatrice. "My wife tells me you've been making jokes about her weight, Vincent," Albert said softly, pouring himself a measure of Macallan from the bottle Vincent had been drinking from. "She tells me you instructed the catering staff to keep the carving station stocked just for her." Vincent was sweating profusely. Albert, it was just talk. She was an outsider. We didn't understand why you married her. I married her because I recognize an apex predator when I see one, Albert replied, taking a sip of the scotch, which is a vision you clearly lack. Albert turned to his wife. Darling, he's yours. Beatrice walked slowly around the table. The capos pressed themselves against the mahogany walls, terrified to even breathe as she passed. She stopped behind Camilla's chair. The sleek mistress was sobbing quietly, her makeup running down her face in dark streaks. Beatrice leaned down, her mouth close to Camilla's ear. You can keep the diamonds, she whispered. Consider them a parting gift. Now run. Camilla didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled out of her chair, her heels clicking frantically as she fled the room, leaving her lover behind. Beatrice turned her attention to Vincent. He tried to draw his revolver, but Beatrice's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist and slamming it down onto the heavy oak table. She pinned his hand flat, her immense strength rendering his struggles utterly useless. With her free hand, Beatrice picked up the heavy baccarat crystal decanter, filled with scotch. I don't mind the jokes, Vincent, Beatrice said, her voice a calm, soothing murmur as she looked down into his terrified, tear-filled eyes. I've heard them all my life. They are white noise. But you sold my husband to the Volkovs. You invited a war into my home. Please, Vincent begged, his voice cracking. Beatrice, please. It's Mrs. Sterling to you, she corrected him. She brought the heavy crystal decanter down with devastating force onto Vincent's pinned hand. The sound of shattering bones echoed like gunshots in the silent room. Vincent screamed, a high, agonizing wail. Beatrice released him, letting him collapse onto the floor, clutching his ruined, mangled hand to his chest. She turned to face the 4 remaining capos. They were seasoned, hardened killers, men who had seen every depravity the underworld had to offer. But as they looked at the heavily built, beautiful woman in the black velvet dress, standing over the broken body of their underboss, they felt true, visceral fear. The Volkov Bratva will be eliminated by the end of the week, Beatrice addressed the room, her tone echoing the absolute authority of a queen addressing her court. Any man in this room who questions my husband's leadership or my place at his side will join Vincent. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Mrs. Sterling, Salvatore rasped, bowing his head deeply, the other capos instantly following suit. Albert walked over to his wife. He ignored the groaning Vincent on the floor. He wrapped his good arm around Beatrice's waist, pulling her flush against his side. The mockery was over. The whispered jokes were dead. Albert looked at the men who had once laughed at his bride. Call the cleaners, Albert ordered the capos. My wife and I have a war to plan. The underground command center of the Sterling Syndicate was a relic from the Cold War, buried deep beneath an unassuming parking garage in Lower Manhattan. For decades, it had been used strictly for high-level money laundering operations and securing the Syndicate's deepest secrets. Now, it was a war room. The atmosphere around the massive, illuminated tactical table was profoundly different than any meeting Albert Sterling had hosted before. The remaining capos, Salvatore, Dominic, Leo, and Carmine, stood with their hands firmly clasped behind their backs. They were seasoned killers who controlled thousands of men, yet their eyes kept darting nervously toward the head of the table. Albert sat in a high-backed leather chair, his left arm immobilized in a black tactical sling, the stark white bandages beneath his tailored dress shirt a reminder of his brush with death. But he wasn't the one running the meeting. Beatrice stood opposite him, leaning over the glowing map of the tri-state area. Gone were the frumpy, oversized dresses she had used to camouflage herself. Today, she wore a pair of heavy, black tactical trousers and a fitted, dark grey combat sweater that showcased the thick, muscular build she had spent years cultivating. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, utilitarian braid. She moved wooden markers across the map with the detached, clinical precision of a chess grandmaster moving pawns. "Grigory Volkov is arrogant, but he isn't stupid," Beatrice stated, her voice calm, projecting effortlessly across the bunker. "He knows Vincent failed, he knows Albert is alive, and he knows his element of surprise is gone. Right now, he is pulling his top enforcers back to their strongholds. He expects us to retaliate with a massive, frontal assault on his nightclubs in Brighton Beach. With respect, Mrs. Sterling," Dominic, a capo with a jagged scar running down his jaw, ventured cautiously. He used her title with a rigid, genuine reverence that had been beaten into him the night she shattered Vincent's hand. "That's exactly what we should do. We have the numbers. We flood Brighton Beach, burn his fronts to the ground, and send a message." Beatrice didn't look up from the map. "If we hit Brighton Beach, we lose 50 men to his rooftop snipers before we even cross the avenue. It's a meat grinder. That's how old-school mobsters fight. They trade blood for pride." She finally looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Dominic. "I don't trade blood. I eliminate the threat." Albert watched his wife, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips. He poured a glass of bourbon with his good hand, utterly mesmerized by the sheer, unadulterated competence radiating from her. "Then what is the play, Beatrice?" Albert asked softly, giving her the floor completely. Beatrice reached into the deep cargo pocket of her trousers and pulled out a small encrypted flash drive. She tossed it onto the glass surface of the table. "My father," she began, her tone devoid of any familial warmth, "was executed by the Bratva because he embezzled $4 million. But that wasn't why the Volkovs wanted him erased. When he cooked their books, he didn't just see the money. He saw the logistical supply chain." She tapped the screen on the table, plugging the drive into a terminal. The map shifted, highlighting a sprawling, industrial shipping yard in Newark, New Jersey. "Grigory doesn't just smuggle narcotics," Beatrice explained. "He's moving military surplus out of Eastern Europe. The money my father stole was the operational budget for a massive shipment of RPGs, heavy ordnance, and C4 explosives. That shipment arrived 3 days ago. It's sitting in a warehouse in Newark." The capos exchanged uneasy glances. Salvatore whistled low. "Military grade? Boss, if Grigory equips his street soldiers with that kind of hardware, our armored SUVs won't mean a damn thing. They'll blow us off the map." "Exactly," Beatrice said flatly. "Which is why we aren't going to let him distribute it. Grigory operates out of a fortified office above that warehouse. He thinks his heavy artillery is his trump card. We are going to turn it into his funeral pyre." "It's a fortress, Mrs. Sterling," Carmine protested mildly. "He'll have 50 heavily armed men guarding that ordnance." Beatrice stood up straight, her broad shoulders squared. "He has 50 men expecting a gang war. They are expecting drive-by shootings and men in suits with submachine guns. They aren't expecting a Tier 1 tactical breach." She turned to Albert. "I need 12 of your most disciplined men. Not thugs, not trigger-happy street soldiers. I need men who know how to follow absolute silence protocols. And I need Galloway's private security to supply me with heavy breaching charges." Albert swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "You want to lead the strike team yourself?" "I know the structural layout of the warehouse from my father's files," Beatrice replied, her gaze unwavering. "I know the blind spots in their thermal camera sweeps. If you send your men in blind, they will trip the pressure sensors on the perimeter." "It's too dangerous, Beatrice," Albert said, though his tone wasn't a reprimand. It was the possessive concern of a man who had finally found his equal. "You proved your point at the upstate compound. You don't need to put yourself in the line of fire." Beatrice walked around the table, stopping beside Albert's chair. She reached down, her strong, calloused hand gently tracing the line of his uninjured jaw. The capos collectively looked away, terrified of witnessing such an intimate moment. "Albert," she whispered, leaning down so only he could hear. "High society thinks I'm a joke. Vincent thought I was a victim. Grigory Volkov still thinks I'm just a fat, helpless civilian. Let me use that one last time. Let me show the underworld exactly what happens when they underestimate the Sterling Syndicate." Albert looked into her eyes. There was no fear in them, only a cold, absolute resolve. He realized then that he hadn't married a pawn. He had married a general. Albert turned back to his capos. "Give my wife whatever she needs. If a single man disobeys her orders on the ground, I will personally flay him alive. Are we understood?" "Yes, boss," the capos chorused in unison. Beatrice straightened up, her face returning to a mask of tactical indifference. "We strike at 0300 hours. Gentlemen, go brief your men." The Newark shipping yard was a desolate, rusting graveyard of corrugated metal and towering cranes, battered by an unrelenting, freezing rain. The smell of salt, diesel, and rotting seaweed hung heavy in the air. At exactly 0245 hours, the camera feeds on the eastern perimeter flickered and died, locked in a continuous loop by a remote hacking device Beatrice had planted earlier that evening. Albert sat in the back of an armored mobile command vehicle a mile away, watching the thermal drone feed on a bank of monitors. His shoulder ached fiercely, but the pain was eclipsed by a nervous, adrenaline-fueled tension. He watched as 13 heat signatures moved through the rain with the disciplined, synchronized precision of a military strike force. At the head of the formation was Beatrice. She was a terrifying vision of modern warfare. She wore a heavy, custom-fitted plate carrier that accommodated her broad chest and back, laden with extra magazines and flashbangs. A matte black ballistic helmet covered her head, fitted with quad-tube night vision goggles. In her hands, she gripped a heavily modified Benelli M4 tactical shotgun, loaded with alternating armor-piercing slugs and tungsten buckshot. Her weight, once the subject of cruel mockery in grand ballrooms, was now her greatest asset. She moved with a low, unshakable center of gravity. The heavy tactical gear that would have exhausted a smaller woman barely slowed her down. She was an unstoppable force, wrapped in Kevlar. "Vanguard to Overlord," Beatrice's calm voice crackled over Albert's earpiece. "We have reached the southern service door. Setting charges." "Copy that, Vanguard," Albert replied, his voice a low rumble. "Thermal shows 3 guards on the other side of that door. Give them hell, my love." In the rain, Beatrice signaled her lead breacher. A strip of C4 was slapped onto the reinforced steel hinges of the door. She stepped back, raising her left hand, counting down on her fingers. 3, 2, 1. The explosion was deafening, a concussive shock wave that shattered the freezing night. Before the smoke even began to clear, Beatrice was moving. She surged through the mangled doorway, her Benelli barking a brutal, rhythmic roar. Boom! Boom! The 2 guards closest to the door, stunned by the blast, were instantly pulverized by the tungsten buckshot, thrown backward into the crates of illicit cargo. The 3rd guard managed to raise his AK-47, but Beatrice didn't flinch. She pumped the action and fired a slug that punched through the man's level 3 body armor as if it were wet cardboard, dropping him instantly. "Entry secured. Pushing to the 2nd level," she relayed coldly. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Sirens wailed and floodlights snapped on, blinding the night vision. Beatrice tore off her goggles, tossing them aside, and transitioned flawlessly to the holographic sight on her weapon. Grigory's men poured out from the upper catwalks, raining fully automatic fire down on the strike team. "Covering fire!" Beatrice roared over the din of battle. Her men, deeply loyal and thoroughly terrified of her, immediately laid down a suppressing barrage. Beatrice didn't take cover behind the crates. She moved relentlessly forward, a juggernaut of violence. She used the concrete support pillars, pieing the corners, picking off targets with surgical, devastating shotgun blasts. She was mathematically dissecting the room, calculating angles, completely devoid of fear. She reached the iron stairwell leading to Grigori's fortified office. "Hold the ground floor," she ordered her squad. "The target is mine." She ascended the stairs alone, her boots ringing out against the metal grating. At the top, a massive, steel-reinforced door stood between her and the leader of the Bratva. Beatrice slung her shotgun over her back. She didn't have time for another breaching charge. She drew her customized Glock 19 and aimed directly at the heavy digital locking mechanism. 3 rapid shots shattered the housing. She took a step back, raised her heavy tactical boot, and kicked the door with the force of a battering ram. The locking bolts sheared off, and the door flew open. Inside the lavishly furnished office, Grigory Volkov stood behind a massive mahogany desk. He was a mountain of a man, covered in prison tattoos, holding a massive, gold-plated Desert Eagle. He fired twice as the door opened. The massive .50 caliber rounds tore through the air. One missed entirely. The second grazed the thick ceramic plate on Beatrice's side, the kinetic impact staggering her slightly. But she didn't fall. Before Grigory could re-aim, Beatrice fired. She didn't aim for his chest armor. She shot him in the right kneecap. Grigory roared in agony, his leg buckling, sending him crashing to the floor. The heavy Desert Eagle slid across the hardwood. Beatrice walked into the room, her weapon trained on his head. Grigory, gasping in pain, looked up at the figure standing over him. He wiped blood from his mouth and let out a wet, mocking laugh. "So," the Russian wheezed. Sterling didn't even have the spine to come himself. He sent his fat, ugly bride to do his wet work. Beatrice didn't get angry. She didn't monologue. She simply holstered her sidearm, stepped forward, and drove the heel of her heavy combat boot directly into Grigory's shattered knee. The mob boss screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated torment. "My husband handles the business," Beatrice said softly, crouching down so she was eye-level with the massive Russian. "I handle the pest control." She grabbed Grigory by the collar of his silk shirt, her immense strength pulling his heavy frame upward. "My father was a coward, but he taught me how to read a ledger, and he taught me how to burn an empire." She released him, letting him collapse back to the floor in agony. She pulled a remote detonator from her tactical vest. Before the raid, her team had rigged the structural pillars surrounding the massive crates of C4 on the ground floor. "Tell the devil that the Whale of Wall Street sent you," Beatrice whispered. She turned and walked out of the office, slamming the mangled door behind her. She descended the stairs, rejoining her men who had secured the lower level. "Fall back," she ordered. 2 minutes to detonation." The strike team moved like ghosts, evaporating into the rainy night, leaving the crippled, bleeding Grigory locked in his office above a mountain of explosives. Beatrice reached the armored command vehicle just as the timer hit 0. She pressed the detonator. The earth shook violently. A massive, blinding fireball erupted into the sky, tearing the roof off the warehouse and vaporizing millions of dollars of military ordnance, along with the leader of the Volkov Bratva. The shockwave rattled the heavy armor of the mobile command unit. The heavy doors of the vehicle opened. Albert stepped out into the freezing rain, ignoring his sling, his eyes reflecting the blazing inferno of the destroyed warehouse. Beatrice walked up to him. She was covered in soot, rain, and the blood of her enemies. She pulled off her ballistic helmet, letting her wet hair fall around her shoulders. She was breathing heavily, the adrenaline finally beginning to taper off. Albert looked at the destruction she had wrought. The East Coast underworld had just been violently rearranged. He reached out, pulling her heavy, armored body against his chest. He didn't care about the rain or the soot. He kissed her, a fierce, bruising, passionate claim. It wasn't the sterile kiss of their wedding day. It was the fiery devotion of a king to his queen. "You are magnificent," Albert murmured against her lips, the heat of the burning warehouse warming them in the cold night. Beatrice rested her forehead against his chest, her arms wrapping around him. "The bratva is done. The commission is yours." "Ours," Albert corrected her softly, holding her tight against him. "The commission is ours. And I pity anyone who ever tries to take it from us." The destruction of the Volkov bratva wasn't just a victory for the Sterling Syndicate. It was a seismic shockwave that fundamentally altered the ecosystem of the East Coast elite. The underworld knew the truth, that a heavily built, supposedly meek accountant's daughter had orchestrated the decapitation of the Russian mob. But the legitimate world, the corrupt politicians and high society socialites who fed off Albert Sterling's wealth, were still operating under the dangerous illusion that Beatrice was a punchline. It was time to correct their vision. 2 weeks after the Newark shipping yard burned to the ground, Albert booked the entirety of the private dining room at Le Bernardin, the profoundly exclusive French seafood restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. It was a mandatory dinner for the legitimate wing of the Sterling Empire, the state senators, the union bosses, the district attorneys on the payroll, and their impeccably starved wives. The room was a sea of Tom Ford tuxedos, vintage Hermes Birkin bags, and nervous energy. Senator Reginald Astor, the man who had joked about Albert widening his penthouse doors at the wedding, stood near the private bar, swirling a glass of 50-year-old Louis XIII cognac. Beside him was Cynthia DuPont, draped in a sheer Prada gown, her eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors. "I heard Albert is still recovering," Astor murmured to Cynthia, checking the time on his platinum Patek Philippe. "And that the wife is insisting on handling his schedule. It's absurd. The girl can barely string a sentence together without looking at her shoes." "She's probably just milking his injury for the black card," Cynthia sneered, though her voice lacked its usual venom. The rumors bleeding out of the underworld were deeply unsettling, even if she refused to believe them. At exactly 8 o'clock, the doors opened. The ambient chatter in the room died instantly. Albert Sterling walked in first. He was no longer wearing the tactical sling, though he moved his left shoulder with a deliberate, guarded stiffness. He looked every inch the apex predator of New York, his sharp features set in a mask of absolute, chilling authority. But it was the woman on his arm who paralyzed the room. Beatrice did not try to shrink herself. She did not wear the oversized, frumpy floral prints or the high-necked lace she had hidden behind for months. She wore a custom, tailored Alexander McQueen suit in deep, midnight blue. The heavy silk draped perfectly over her broad shoulders and thick thighs, cinched at her waist with a subtle leather corset that emphasized her powerful, imposing silhouette. Her dark hair was slicked back, her makeup minimal but razor-sharp. She looked like a billionaire CEO arriving for a hostile takeover. "Good evening," Albert said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the silent room. He didn't guide Beatrice to her seat. He stepped back, allowing her to walk ahead of him. It was a subtle shift in physical dynamics, but to the sharks in the room, it was a glaring red flag. The king was deferring to the queen. Beatrice walked directly to the head of the long table. She didn't look at the floor. Her dark, calculating eyes swept over the politicians and socialites, mentally categorizing their utility and their threat levels. Senator Astor cleared his throat, attempting to break the suffocating tension. He stepped forward, pasting on a politician's smile. "Albert, my boy, good to see you on your feet." And Beatrice, you look different. Beatrice turned her gaze to the senator. Different than a marshmallow wrapped in lace, Senator Astor? She asked, her voice a smooth, icy calm. Astor's face drained of color. His hand, holding the crystal glass of cognac, began to tremble. She heard that. She heard that at the wedding. I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Sterling, Astor stammered, glancing desperately at Albert for a lifeline. Albert simply pulled out Beatrice's chair for her. My wife has a perfect memory, Reginald. It is one of her many exceptional qualities. Beatrice sat down, resting her forearms on the white linen tablecloth. Please, everyone, take your seats. We have a great deal of syndicate business to discuss, and I have very little patience for inefficiency. Cynthia DuPont, sitting 3 seats down, stared in open-mouthed shock. Syndicate business? With all due respect, Albert, since when does your wife sit in on union contract negotiations? Beatrice didn't let her husband answer. She leaned forward, locking eyes with Cynthia. Since the men who used to negotiate those contracts proved themselves incompetent. Vincent Hayes is currently learning how to eat with his non-dominant hand in a private medical facility. Grigory Volkov is ash. The board has been restructured, Cynthia. Beatrice reached into the breast pocket of her McQueen jacket and withdrew a thick, leather-bound ledger, the very ledger her father had died for, now updated with her own meticulous, terrifyingly accurate forensic accounting. She tossed it onto the center of the table. The heavy thud echoed like a gavel. I have spent the last 2 weeks auditing the syndicate's legitimate fronts, Beatrice announced to the room. Senator Astor, you are skimming 4% off the top of the municipal waste contracts. District Attorney Reynolds, your off-the-books slush fund in the Cayman Islands is sloppy. You used your mother's maiden name for the shell company. The men at the table looked as if they had been struck by lightning. The silent, overweight girl they had ruthlessly mocked was currently dismantling their lives with the casual boredom of someone reading a grocery list. From this moment forward, Beatrice continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous, silken register. The tax for doing business in Albert City is raised to 20%. And you will report directly to me. If your ledgers are off by a single cent, I will not send lawyers. I will come to your homes myself. Albert stood behind her chair, a dark, fiercely proud smile on his lips. He poured a glass of vintage Bordeaux and placed it next to her hand. You heard my wife, Albert said softly to the terrified room. Eat your dinner. It's going to be a very long, very profitable year. 6 months later, the mocking whispers had been entirely replaced by a terrified, reverent silence. The high society wives who once sneered at Beatrice now scrambled to send her lavish gifts, hoping to earn a nod of acknowledgement from the most powerful woman in the city. The men who had underestimated her now sweated through their bespoke suits whenever she entered a room. The Sterling Syndicate had never been stronger, richer, or more lethal. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the rain was hammering against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse overlooking Central Park. The city below was a sprawling grid of neon and shadows, oblivious to the rulers pacing above it. Beatrice stood in the center of Albert's massive study, stripped of her designer suits. She wore loose black sweatpants and a heavy grey combat shirt, her hands wrapped in white athletic tape. She was working the heavy punching bag suspended from the reinforced ceiling, her bare feet pivoting perfectly on the hardwood. Thwack, thwack, crack. Her strikes were devastating, born of raw, dense muscle and years of brutal, unglamorous training. Sweat gleamed on her forehead as she drove a vicious elbow into the leather, the chain rattling wildly against the ceiling. Albert sat in a leather wingback chair in the corner of the room, a glass of bourbon resting on his knee, watching her. He was utterly mesmerized. He had spent his entire life surrounded by women who starved themselves to fit into a mold dictated by magazines and societal expectations. They were fragile, decorative things. But Beatrice was a force of nature. She was heavy, solid, and capable of breathtaking violence. She was the only person in the world who made him feel truly safe. Beatrice stopped her workout, chest heaving slightly as she unwrapped the tape from her knuckles. She walked over to Albert's desk, picking up a sleek, encrypted tablet. The shipment of European luxury cars cleared customs at the Baltimore docks an hour ago, she noted, scrolling through the manifest. I had Dominic route the payment through the New Shell Corporation in Zurich. Clean, untraceable, and the union bosses took their cut without a single complaint. Albert set his glass down and stood up. He closed the distance between them, wrapping his arms around her solid waist from behind, pressing his chest against her back. He kissed the curve of her sweaty shoulder, inhaling the scent of her. Dominic wouldn't dare complain, Albert murmured, his voice a low rumble against her skin. He's terrified of you. They all are. Beatrice leaned back into his embrace, a soft, genuine smile touching her lips. Is it bad that I enjoy it? Watching those arrogant men flinch when I look at them? It's not bad, my love, Albert said, turning her around so he could look into her dark, intense eyes. It's survival. You taught me that. You let them think you were prey, right up until the moment you locked the jaws. He reached up, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. The marriage that had begun as a cold, strategic transaction, a joke laughed at by the elite, had forged the most unbreakable bond in the underworld. They were equals, two apex predators sharing the same throne. No more hiding, Beatrice, Albert whispered fiercely, his eyes blazing with dark devotion. No more oversized dresses, no more keeping your eyes on the floor. You own this city. You own me. Beatrice's hands came up to grip the lapels of his open shirt, her grip tight and possessive. She pulled him down into a bruising, passionate kiss, a collision of teeth and heat that tasted of bourbon and absolute power. When she finally pulled away, she looked out the rain-streaked window at the glittering skyline of New York. I know, Beatrice replied, her voice echoing the terrifying certainty of a queen who had conquered her kingdom in the dark. And heaven help the fool who ever tries to take it from us. What a truly epic evolution for Beatrice. From being the punchline of high society to becoming the terrifying, undeniable matriarch of the Sterling Syndicate, she proved that true power doesn't come from fitting into a mold. It comes from being the one who breaks it. Albert, finally realizing he didn't marry a pawn, but a brilliant, lethal queen, is the ultimate dark romance payoff. If you loved this story of brutal revenge, tactical brilliance, and a love forged in the fires of an underworld war, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to ring the notification bell so you never miss our dark, thrilling audio dramas. Drop a comment below. Which moment was your favorite? Was it Beatrice shattering Vincent's hand, or her absolutely destroying the corrupt politicians at Le Bernardin? Share this video with anyone who loves an underdog story with a seriously dark twist, and I'll see you in the next one.